The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello, this is Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar, talking today with Desmond Morris, whose 1967 bestseller, The Naked Ape, first brought worldwide attention to his observations about animals, including human animals. He made body language a household phrase. He's a painter whose works have been exhibited in New York, Paris, and London. And he's just published his 27th book. It's called Animal Watching, a book, Desmond Morris, you say brings the animal kingdom down to our level. I couldn't tell if you were flippant or you really meant that.
Well, I've always looked at humans and animals in the same way. That's why my studies of humans have provoked such comment. But you see, I started as a zoologist, and for 20 years I studied animal behavior and looked at a wide variety of species. I began with fish, and then I moved on to birds, mammals, eventually chimpanzees. And finally, and logically, I looked at the human animal. And as you say, I wrote The Naked Ape. Now, of course, that caused a lot of trouble, not just because I was looking at people just as though it was another species, but also because I was intruding into the territory of anthropologists and psychologists and psychiatrists. And they say, well, what's this zoologist think he's doing, talking about our species? But I said, no, human beings are animals, remarkable, wonderful animals, but they are available for study by a zoologist like myself. And for the next 20 years, I wrote books about human beings from 67 to 87. Then I got restless. I thought 20 years on one species is long enough. So I decided to go back to the animals. And I wrote cat watching, dog watching, and horse watching on animal companions, our closest animal companions. And then I thought, it's time I wrote the book I should have written all those years ago when I was studying animal behavior. And I wrote this new book, Animal Watching, to cover the whole variety of wild animals and to show the many extraordinary ways in which they survive. Because you see, for me, as a watcher of animals, because I could never do experiments on animals, I'm not an experimentalist, and I nearly gave up zoology because it was so experimental. And I thought, no, I don't want to do that. And then I discovered that there was a branch of zoology called ethology, which was scientific observation, controlled, quantified observation. So it wasn't just natural history, it wasn't just a hobby, it was a serious science which enabled me to study animal behavior without intruding on the animals, without messing them about, without interfering with them. And that gave me something I wanted to communicate. I wanted to say to people, the animal world is fascinating. Every time you see an animal and it has a color patch or a pattern or a shape or an action, it means something in terms of the survival of that animal.
That was a sentence that I wrote down that's in the introduction to Animal Watching, that for the serious student of the animal kingdom, everything has a special meaning. And it sounded like a statement of faith, almost a religion.
Yes, it's the faith you must start out with, otherwise you wouldn't do anything. It doesn't mean that I can't see the beauty of animals. When I go into a coral reef and I see the extraordinary colors of the fish there, I'm knocked out by this. I haven't become a sort of a cold scientist who's incapable of enjoying the beauty when he's studying the animal behavior. But you see, if you don't start out with the idea that every red spot, every black and white stripe, every twitch and jump and jerk and movement of an animal, if you don't start out with the idea that it has some survival value, then you've got nothing to study. Now, I'm not saying that I can give you the answer to all these questions. I can't. But it's a good idea to start that way. And if you have that sort of Darwinian act of faith, then it means that you sit and watch and try to understand. And you've got to put yourself in the animal's position. You have to think like the animal, not like a human being.
There's a wonderful chapter in the book that really illustrates both the fact that everything has a special meaning and that sometimes there's no perfect answer, and that's why does a zebra have stripes?
Yes, well, that's the first chapter in the book, because I wanted, particularly for young zoologists or young naturalists, I wanted to say, look, we don't know all the answers. There's a tremendous amount out there to be discovered. It's not a closed book, it's a very open book. And so that first chapter, I looked around for something basic, but something we don't know the answer to. Now, we don't know why zebras got stripes, even today. And so I thought that would be a good example. I mean, the rest of the book is full of chapters that tells us things we do know, but the first chapter tells us something we don't know. And there are 9 different theories as to why a zebra has stripes. I won't go through them all, but just let me give you an example. The old idea that it's camouflage is ridiculous. If you go to Africa, the zebra, incredibly conspicuous animals. They don't hide in the undergrowth as it's often claimed they do. They're out there in the open, the lions can see them, and the black and white is very conspicuous. So forget the camouflage. So what else could it be? Well, then let me give you the most outrageous suggestion, and that is that it is an insect repellent. That stinging insects, which carry very serious diseases, don't like landing on that vivid black and white pattern. And that gives the zebra an advantage because it doesn't get diseases. That, I think, is a very ingenious idea, something that could actually be tested. And another idea is that it's a cooling device, that the black and white pattern produces currents of air. Because
I like that one.
That's a good one. Another theory is that the black and white patterns, which are as unique to each zebra as fingerprints are on us, are used as personal identification within a herd of zebra. So each zebra knows the other zebra by the exact line on their faces. And if you look closely, and there's a photograph in the book which shows you several zebra together, and if you look at the faces very closely, you go from one to the other, you'll see how there is a little, it's just like fingerprints, there's just that little difference in the pattern. And there are 9 theories altogether, but I won't go through them all.
I hadn't realized until I looked at that chapter that there are also different species of zebras that have different types of stripes. I mean, all zebras' stripes are not the same.
Particularly in the rump. I have to tell you that it's the zebra's rump where you must look if you really want to know which kind of zebra you're dealing with, because the stripes at the side, yes, an expert can spot them, but the most vivid difference is in the rump region, and that's not an accident. It's because, of course, if you're a zebra and you're fleeing and there's panic, that's the moment you want to be able to follow your kind and not somebody else's kind, because that's the time the herd wants to keep together. And in the rump region, the 3 rump regions, there are 3 quite different kinds of patterns, and the stripes become most different in those areas. So that's something which most people don't notice, of course. Very often, you know, with an animal, because it has one kind of pattern that we're familiar with, we miss another one. Take the tiger. That has stripes, and in the tiger's case, as it shows in one of the photographs in the book, it is a camouflage. The tiger does live in the right sort of environment for those orange and dark stripes to camouflage it. But because we're so familiar with the stripes of the tiger, we sometimes overlook the fact that it's got vivid white patches, one patch on the back of each ear. Now, this is a very important signal with tigers, because when a tiger gets angry, it rotates its ear. If this is the ear here, and I'm getting angry and I'm a tiger, I do that before I flatten it. So a cat will always flatten its ears to protect them during a fight. So halfway to flattening, there's alert, there's halfway, and there's flat. So when it is getting angry, it rotates its ears, and then these big white spots with black rings around them point forwards like 2 huge white eyes staring at you. And when you see that, it's a good time to leave.
You know you're in trouble. You know, I was thinking as I was looking through this book, how many of us in this country grew up and got a lot of our ideas about animals from Disney movies. and was wondering what kind of peculiar notions that gave us about, I think of bear country and the bears doing the Roomba up against the tree to scratch their backs and that sort of thing.
Yes, he did. I would say two things about Disney. The good news was that he did bring true life animal films, as he called them, to the screen, and in a big way. The bad news was that he jazzed them up, literally in many cases. There was a scorpion, square dance, and all the rest of it. And it was a pity that he felt the need to do that. But he was a pioneer, and you must forgive him those few foibles. But because he did introduce nature films to a very wide public in this country. And they were brilliantly filmed. But, of course, he was a little anthropomorphic. He felt the need to make the dances fit to human music. Now, animal dances are very interesting, and many animals do dance when they're displaying what we call dancing. But in fact, what it is that when animals are, let's take courtship, when animals are courting one another prior to mating, they aren't just sexy, they're also slightly scared. And they might even be slightly aggressive. And you have these three urges, aggression, fear, and sexuality, and they conflict with one another. And the conflict produces a lot of ambivalent behavior. So you have a sexual approach and then a moment of fear, sexual approach, fear. So you get animals that will move back and forward. Or you get a bird which wants to approach but then wants to take off. So it keeps doing this because this is a takeoff movement. It's what we call an intention movement of taking off and flying up. So the bird does this, and you see these birds doing these dances which look weird, but they're easy to understand once you trace their origins. And that's, of course, what the animal watcher does.
And you don't really need Roomba music to appreciate it.
No, I think well, actually, if you want to bring up that, human dancing is of the same kind of thing, because most human dancing occurs in two contexts, and that is getting ready for war. You have the war dance. I've been filming that with the Maasai in Africa, and when they're doing their war dance, it's if you're close to and you get a group of young Maasai warriors doing this, it's really it makes you can feel the threat, and it's because their war dance, which involves a sort of jumping in the air and going and they're all jumping up and down, making this deep breathing noise. And it is like a kind of, I'm coming to get you, I'm coming to get you. And the rhythm of it synchronizes the group and makes them aggressive as a group. With ballroom dancing, with disco dancing, there you have dancing used like courtship dancing in animals, where it's used for sexual arousal. See, one of the problems with sex is that in the animal world is that you have to have not only have you got to get rid of these other feelings of fear and aggression and become purely sexual. As you know, anxiety is a terrible anti-sexual phenomenon. Any lovers who are anxious, it gets in the way of that relaxed sexual moment. And it's the same with animals. And to get the sexuality at full strength, they have to not only become sexually aroused, but they have to synchronize that arousal. And that's why in so many animals' courtship, there's a long series of movements repeated over and over again as the male and female synchronize their arousal.
You used the word anthropomorphic a bit ago, and I'm interested in that whole concept because it really forms the core of the way a lot of people view animals. It's the way they understand them, is to give them human characteristics. Does that really damage our ability to understand the animal kingdom, to understand our place in the animal kingdom?
It does distort our understanding. There is another word which you hardly ever hear, which is theriomorphic. That's the opposite of anthropomorphic. That means seeing the animal and not the human when you look. Now, I have had to train myself as an animal watcher to get myself into the mind of the animal I'm studying. If it's a fish, I have to try and start thinking what it's like to have fins instead of arms, and you have to also think about gills instead of a mouth, and instead of having a nose, they have these sort of. You have to think about the gills, And well, of course, they have nostrils, but that's a separate issue. But you have to think of a fish with its gills and its fins, and you have to think about yourself moving like this instead of walking. And the moment you begin to think like a fish, you begin to understand their movements and their actions more clearly. You can see the way in which, if they display with their fins, you can see how, as they stop a movement, their fins spread. It's a balancing action. And so you have, if there's a need to balance the fish in a special way, you get the spreading of a fin. Now, if you get the spreading of a fin, that's why you get such bright markings on that fin. And to give you an example of how difficult it is to understand unless you study it properly, there's a little fish called a mouth brooder. Now this fish, the female, lays her eggs, picks them up in her mouth and keeps them in her mouth and gargles them there to keep them oxygenated and lets them grow into a small fry inside her mouth where they're protected from the outside world. The enemies can't get at them and kill them because they're in her mouth. She has to stop feeding, she has to be a very good mother and not eat anything while she's got her mouth full of eggs developing. But how does she fertilize them? That's the problem. How does she get these? Because she picks them up as she lays them, so they're not fertilized. And the way this is done is quite extraordinary. The male, when he sees her laying eggs, this excites him, and he lies on his side and spreads his fins. And when he does this, on his lower fin, there are some white spots which are like dummy eggs, and they're just markings on his fin. When he shows those dummy markings to the female, she thinks she's missed a few eggs. So she goes down, she's picked up all the real eggs, she sees his fin with these white spots on, she goes down and tries to pick up the eggs that she thinks are still there. Now, of course, she can't, so she keeps on nibbling his fin, and this excites him and makes him ejaculate. And she goes on trying to pick up the eggs, but what she does in fact pick up is his milt, his cloud of sperm, and fertilizes her eggs. So that is a way in which a marking of 3 or 4 little white spots, which might just look pretty at first sight, has a very specific function.
Where did you develop your passion for knowing about animals?
Very young. I was an only child. I spent a lot of time in the countryside watching animals. My family had a small lake, and I built a raft and floated on the lake and watched the fish and the birds. And I, unlike my friends, I never wanted to shoot animals. I just wanted to study them. I don't know why, because all my friends were out blazing away in the countryside, hunting, shooting, fishing, and I, for some reason, I didn't want to do that. I think I got to know them so well that they were like friends, and you don't want to go around shooting your friends, do you?
And maybe it's because you had an aviary in your house.
My father was extraordinary. He built a huge aviary, and it was an outside aviary with lots of birds in it, and then he knocked a hole in the wall and brought the aviary right into the house so the birds could fly into the house and then out again. And so I was surrounded by animals from a very early age.
You also had a great-grandfather who was a great popularizer, and I read a story about the discovery of a microscope that you found inspirational.
This was old Badger Morris, he was called, yes. He stamped out badger baiting, or tried to. He was an old Victorian naturalist, and he I was lucky because in the farthest recess of the family attic, I found, as I was a small boy, I found his old microscope, beautiful brass microscope, and an old book, and a 17th century book called Comparative Anatomy of Stomachs and Guts Begun. Wonderful title. And it had all these marvelous pictures in it. And I started using this microscope and found a whole new world under this microscope, and it was very exciting to discover. It was like a voyage of discovery. It was almost like finding an alien world, you know, because I didn't know what was going on in pond water, and there were all these incredible creatures, and I found them absolutely fascinating. It's
almost like it was destiny that you would do this.
Well, it's certainly his presence influenced me. He started his own newspaper, and indeed he visited this country and traveled all around this country about 120 years ago, and wrote a book called voyage to United States and Canada, and I thought one day about recreating his journey. It'd be pretty different today. When he was here, I think they were having a little fire in Chicago at the time, and his observations as a naturalist were very interesting, and I thought I'd recreate his journey one day.
So you haven't done everything you want to?
Oh, I got some. No, this is on my tombstone. I wanted to just simply say, life is too short. That is the sad thing about it. That there's so many things I want to see and do that I never get a chance to.
Along with the passionate interest that you developed in zoology, you also developed an interest in painting, and this would not be nature paintings, but a very different kind of painting.
Yes, I was the youngest member of the surrealist movement. I was a teenage surrealist. Sounds like a horror movie. And I'm also the cheapest of the surrealists, which is why people are collecting me now. You see, I was I had my first one-man show in 1948, a long time ago. And I just caught the tail end of the surrealist movement. Nobody wanted to know about my paintings. I couldn't make a living at it. But I went on painting. And I've always had a studio. And then just recently, people have discovered those early paintings. I gave a lot of them away. And they started coming up at Sotheby's and Christie's now, and going into museums. And because I was part of that art history phase. And it's rather strange. I went to Sotheby's to see one of these early paintings being sold. I felt I'd died and had come back to Earth to watch this. I'm just lucky that it's happening while I'm still alive. Usually it doesn't. Usually you've got to die first. You know.
And usually
my
with
gallery
no money.
My gallery says, you know, if you could die, it'd put the values up. But
you mentioned the show in 1948, and I know you've told a story. It's not exactly Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in Paris, but it was something of an outrage when it opened, your first show.
Yes, in those days people were outraged at any sort of avant-garde art. Nowadays it's of course quite accepted, but we forget how big the change of attitude has been. But in those days, in fact, I'm surprised that I had the nerve to exhibit that kind of painting. What I've done, of course, in my paintings is they're meticulous biomorphic paintings in which I have evolved my own sort of world of beings and creatures, and they've slowly evolved as a subjective world, because when I'm animal watching, that's sort of one half of my brain, that's the objective analytical part, and then when I go into my studio, it's a purely subjective part of my brain, and just imagination comes into play. When
you say to someone, I'd like to have you see a couple of my pictures, and you show them to them, don't they say, gee, I thought they'd be animal pictures?
Yeah, but you see, I would never have the nerve to try and recreate. I mean, if you look at some of the pictures in the book, you look at some of those brightly coloured birds, some of the beautiful coats of the mammals in there, the scales of the fish and the insects. There's no way you can compete with that. I would far rather, I don't like animal painting because it can never ever match the beauty of a real feather. So for me, colour photographs of the kind that are in animal watching, that's what I like if I want to see a picture of an animal. Because the structure of a feather, the quality of fur, you can never capture that on canvas. And so for me, animal painting is always a disappointment.
Is there a book coming out soon about you and your painting?
Yes.
So you're being watched?
There is now, yes, a French art historian has decided to analyse all my paintings. I learned some very unusual things about myself, I must say. It's a very strange sensation to read an analysis of your paintings by an art historian. As I say, usually it doesn't happen till after you're dead, so it doesn't worry you. But I've been reading this, and I must say I've learned a little bit more about myself than I did before.
Like what?
Well, my father died when I was young, and he sees that as very significant in my paintings. It would take too long to explain why, but it's something that I hadn't thought of, and I think he's right. I think one of the chapters in the book is called the absence of the father, and that I think is perhaps relevant.
It's like free psychoanalysis in a way.
Yes, it's funny. Some painters, Henry Moore once said to me, I won't read a word people write about me in case it interferes with what I'm doing. And he never wrote, he wouldn't read anything that people wrote about his work. It doesn't worry me that much.
You have your life as a zoologist and your life as a painter, and you also have your life as a writer, and you seem to write in a very distinct way. Your life changes when you begin writing.
I write very quickly. I wrote The Naked Ape in 4 weeks, and I didn't have any longer to write it in. And I find that television was the great training ground for me, because when I was an academic, I wrote complicated academic style. I then joined a television company to make animal programs, and I had to keep my words simple. I had to make myself understood. And I have an enormous debt to television, because I did 500 of these programs. I was on the air every week for about 10 years, 11 years. And that trained me in simple, direct speech. And I always go through my books now to remove any word where I'm just being clever. You know, writers want to show off instead of communicate, and it's one of the weaknesses of scientists. You write quickly, and I also read a description of you're a nocturnal creature when you write your books. Well, the telephones stop at night, you see, and people don't interrupt me. I write from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. each night, and that 6 hours is worth 12 in the daytime. I couldn't write in the daytime, it'd be too much interference. I'm too easily distracted then. It's a pleasant way to work. I get up late though. I mean, I'm not Napoleon. I can't sleep 3 or 4 hours. I need my 8 hours sleep, but I just make it a later rhythm. Only when I'm writing though. You know. Your best known work remains The Naked Ape. Your other books are hugely popular and sell lots of copies, but you can't be introduced without talking about The Naked Ape, which is a 23-year-old work. Does it ever bother you that you always have to go back there? You always have to revisit that? Yes, Orson Welles said Citizen Kane haunts me throughout my entire life. I mean, he did lots of things after that, but it was always Citizen Kane. If you have one success like that, it does tend to haunt you for the rest of your life. It doesn't worry me particularly. I've written, what, 20 books since then, I think, but it was a book of its time. It came at a time when some straight talking was needed, and I told it as I saw it, and I wrote it in a kind of passion, in the sense that it had been building up in me for years, and then I wrote it, as I say, in 4 weeks, in a rush. If I'd taken time to think about it, I'd have been too scared to do it. It's like a courting dance you described a bit ago. It did shock me as I wrote it, but I wrote it honestly, and it has lasted. Sadly, the only thing I've had to change in the new editions is the world population figure. That since I wrote it, there's an additional 1,000 million people on Earth, and we are heading for serious overpopulation problems, and that is interesting. As a biologist, I'm fascinated. Why haven't we got a mechanism to control our population? Other species do. You know, if you're a mouse instead of a man, then if strange mice appear in the area, indicating overpopulation, the females spontaneously abort. They reabsorb their embryos. The embryos that are developing inside the females go into reverse. They're just reabsorbed. And that, the idea that abortion is artificial or unnatural is nonsense, as abortion occurs all over the animal world under those circumstances of overcrowding. And when you get overpopulation like that, the mice have this mechanism. Other species have other mechanisms. Sometimes the fecundity of the female is reduced when there's overcrowding. Now, for some reason, our species has lost that. We haven't. Something has happened to us which has enabled us to overpopulate without this loss of fecundity. And the result is that we are heading for problems. We are going to, if we're not very careful, we're going to really damage this rather small planet we live on. Well, people are getting aware of that now, and that's good news, because people are getting concerned about it. That's one of the lessons from the animal kingdom. Your book is full of them and raises so many questions. For example, as a woman, I can't help but read through the book and say, gee, I mean, were men really meant to lead everything? There seem to be so few species that are led by women. Oh, no. Oh, no, no. Didn't you read about the elephants? Elephants.
Well, the elephants, but they're one of the few.
Oh, no, there are lots of species.
Oh, well, that's good news.
No, I mean, elephants, they are completely dominated by females. I mean, the Victorian naturalists, when they went out shooting elephants in the last century, they always said that's the old bull, you know, because they came from a patriarchy and they thought the big dominant animal must be the bull, but not at all. Females, elephants, have got this solution. They gang up on the males. The males individually are bigger and stronger, but the females gang up on them and keep them out. The males live a solitary life around the edge. They're only allowed in for sex, and the rest of the time they can go jump. You know, they have to. Well, elephants can't jump actually, but you know what I mean. And they're kept on the periphery, and the dominant animal in elephant society is the old cow, the dominant female. And there are many species like this. There's a monkey called the patas monkey. He has such a big harem, about 15 or 16 females, that they totally dominate him. He may be the boss in an administrative sense, but he's pretty henpecked at the same time.
And on that intriguing note, I want to thank Desmond Morris for a wonderful conversation. The example he just gave, one of but thousands that are in his newest book, his 27th. It's called Animal Watching.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.